The night I helped Vivienne Aldrich onto that stage, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near it. I was a parking attendant, not even a full-time one. I was 3 weeks into a seasonal gig at the Harrington Convention Center in downtown Philadelphia, picking up shifts between job applications because my student loans weren't going to defer themselves, and my part-time work at the print shop had dried up when the owner retired. I was 26 years old, driving a rusted-out 2009 Civic, eating a lot of peanut butter sandwiches, and doing exactly what I was paid to do, directing black SUVs and town cars into parking spaces while people in tailored suits walked past me like I was a traffic cone. The Aldrich Family Foundation Gala was the biggest night of the year for Philadelphia's philanthropic community. The foundation raised money for pediatric rehabilitation programs across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and every November they filled the Harrington's main ballroom with the kind of guests who wrote checks with a lot of zeros: politicians, hospital administrators, tech founders who had sold their companies and were now trying to do something meaningful with the money. My supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Bernice, had briefed all of us temp staff that morning. Look sharp, stay invisible, don't make eye contact unless spoken to. The guests had paid $1,500 a plate and they expected a seamless experience. I didn't plan on making myself visible, I really didn't. The first time I saw Vivienne, I almost didn't notice her. She was standing near the coat check on the far side of the lobby, slightly apart from the small clusters of guests who were drifting toward the ballroom doors. She wore a floor-length gown the color of deep burgundy, and her dark hair was pinned up with a few loose strands falling at her temples. From where I was standing, doing a last-minute check on the valet queue, she looked poised, composed, like she belonged there completely. Then I noticed the prosthetic arm. It extended from her right shoulder, a sleek carbon fiber design that caught the lobby light differently than human skin. She held a small clutch in her left hand and had her right arm slightly angled, the way people do when they're aware of a thing about themselves in a room full of strangers. It was a posture I recognized, not from personal experience, from watching my younger sister navigate high school with a visible hearing aid in a world that treated difference as a punchline. That recognition didn't make me do anything. Not yet. I went back to my job. It was about 40 minutes later, during what Bernice had called the transition period between cocktail hour and the formal program, that I was sent inside to help direct guests to their tables. The ballroom was enormous, draped in ivory and gold, with long tables arranged around a central stage. A podium stood at the front bearing the Aldrich Foundation crest. The room smelled like gardenias and expensive cologne. A string quartet was wrapping up their last piece near the side wall. I was stationed near the rear entrance, holding a printed seating chart, trying to be useful without being intrusive, when I heard it. Or rather, heard the absence of something. The MC, a slick man named Darren who I'd seen rehearsing his jokes in the hallway that afternoon, had just introduced the evening's keynote award recipient. He announced the name with the particular warmth people use when they expect applause to immediately follow. The room did applaud, but the person he'd called to the stage didn't appear. He said the name again, a small laugh covering. I think we may have caught our honoree off guard. More laughter, polite, patient. I was scanning the room and that's when I saw her again. Vivienne. She was seated at a table near the left side of the hall, and she had half risen from her chair in the way someone does when they've just realized something terrible. Her face was still composed, but her eyes had gone wide, and she was looking at the empty seat beside her, where, I would learn later, her escort for the evening had been sitting. He was gone. I found out the details weeks after. He'd slipped out during cocktail hour after an argument, took a rideshare to the airport, and caught a red-eye back to New York without a word to anyone. The MC was still at the podium, smiling with increasing effort. Vivienne was the keynote honoree. She was supposed to walk to the stage and receive the Aldrich Foundation's Community Courage Award, given each year to someone whose act of service had cost them something real. I had not known any of this. I just saw a woman at a table alone, in a room full of $1,500 plates, and people who had subtly shifted their chairs so their backs were angled toward her, and I saw her trying to gather herself to stand and walk an aisle alone, while 200 strangers watched when the man who was supposed to walk with her had decided she wasn't worth the evening. I don't know what I thought would happen. I didn't think. That's the truest answer I have. I crossed the ballroom. There were servers in the aisle and I had to angle past them. I could feel a couple of heads turning. I was wearing the standard temp staff vest, dark gray with the Harrington logo on the chest pocket. I was about as out of place moving through that crowd as a paper cup at a crystal dinner table. My heart was doing something loud and unpleasant in my chest. When I reached her table, she was still half standing, and I could see now that her jaw was set tight. Not from emotion, from the effort of keeping emotion at bay. I bent slightly and spoke quietly. I told her I was there if she needed someone to walk up with her. I said it the way you'd say it to anyone, like it was a perfectly normal offer to make. She looked at me, really looked at me. Her eyes were a very dark brown, almost black in that lighting. And for a moment I thought she was going to ask me who I told me I could interrupt her evening. Instead, she said, "Do you know what this award is for?" I told her I didn't. "Not really." She said, "Good. Then you're not doing this for the story." She took my arm. We walked the aisle together. I matched her pace. She did not rush. She moved the way someone moves when they've decided something, slowly enough that it was clearly a choice. People began to see us coming and the room quieted in stages, conversations dropping off table by table as we passed. I stared straight ahead. I was aware of my parking attendant vest in a way I have never been aware of a piece of clothing before or since. I was aware that somewhere behind us, one of the foundation's board members was probably having a minor cardiac event. We reached the foot of the stage steps and she stopped. For just a second, I felt her hand tighten on my arm. Then she climbed and I stayed at the base of the stairs and she walked to the podium alone. The room gave her a standing ovation before she said a single word. I have thought about that a lot since. They stood because they had just watched something, not because they already knew her story, though some of them did. They stood because of the walk, because she had walked the whole length of that room with her back straight, and her head up, and her prosthetic arm in plain sight, next to a man in a parking lot vest, and she had done it without hurrying, without apologizing, without explaining herself to a single person. She collected herself at the podium, smiled at the crowd in a way that was both warm and private, and then she spoke. Her name was Vivian Aldrich. She was the 34-year-old daughter of the foundation's founder, Gordon Aldrich, who was seated in the front row. The award she was receiving was for an incident 2 years earlier on Interstate 95, just north of Wilmington, Delaware. A multi-vehicle pileup during a winter storm had left a school bus partially on its side in the median, with a handful of elementary school kids trapped in the rear section as smoke began to rise from the engine compartment. Vivienne had been 2 cars back. She had gotten out of her car in the middle of a highway during an ice storm and forced open the emergency exit of the bus and helped 4 children out before the fire caught. The last child she pulled out, a 6-year-old girl named Rosie, had been wedged beneath a collapsed seat. Vivienne had used her full body weight to lift the seat frame. The door had slapped back in the wind and closed on her arm. The firefighters who arrived minutes later said they found her sitting in the median holding Rosie in her lap, singing something to keep the girl calm, even as her own arm was destroyed beyond surgical repair. Rosie was in the front row that night too, sitting beside Gordon Aldrich, 8 years old now, in a yellow dress. I found all of this out later in pieces, over the following weeks. Standing at the base of those stage steps, I knew none of it. I just knew that when Vivian spoke, the room that had murmured and tilted away from her was absolutely still. She spoke for 11 minutes. I counted without meaning to. She talked about Rosie. She talked about her father and what his foundation had meant to children going through the kind of recovery she herself had undergone. She talked about walking into a room and watching people's eyes flicker downward before they caught themselves. She said she used to plan her exits before she even arrived somewhere, so she always had a way to leave without people watching her go. Then she paused. She said that tonight, for the first time in a very long time, she hadn't thought about the exit once. If you've ever been in a room when something real happens, you know the quality of that silence. It's not the silence of politeness. It's the silence of 200 people recognizing something true at the same time. She came down from the stage and I was still standing there like an idiot, and she stopped in front of me and said, very quietly, "I don't know your name." I told her. She repeated it once like she was filing it somewhere. Then someone from the foundation was at her elbow, steering her toward the front table, and the room came back to life around us like a current switching back on, and I went back to the rear entrance and tried to remember how to breathe normally. I expected to finish the night and never think about any of it again, except in the way you occasionally replay something strange that happened to you. I thought I'd be back to directing escalades by 10 o'clock. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. 2 mornings later, Bernice called me at 7:15. I was still in bed. She told me to come in an hour early because someone from the Aldrich Foundation had called the Harrington's event manager and asked for my contact information, and the event manager had asked Bernice, and Bernice had given it to them, and she wanted me to know before they called so I didn't think I was in trouble. I thought I was in trouble anyway. The entire drive to the convention center, I convinced myself I'd violated some protocol about staff-guest interaction, that I'd embarrassed someone, that my 3-week seasonal gig was about to become a story I'd tell with a rueful laugh. The person who called was Gordon Aldrich's personal assistant. Her name was Frances, and she had the kind of voice that made you want to sit up straight. She asked if I would be available for a meeting the following Tuesday at the Foundation's offices on Walnut Street. She said, Aldrich would like to speak with me personally. I said yes, obviously I said yes. The Foundation's office was on the 4th floor of a building that felt very serious. Good carpet. Framed photographs of program recipients lining the hallway. Gordon Aldrich turned out to be a compact man in his late 60s with the steady, unhurried manner of someone who has been running things long enough that he doesn't need to perform authority anymore. He shook my hand and pointed to a chairs and said, "Tell me about yourself." I told him the truth. The student loan, the print shop closing, the parking gig, the job applications I was sending out, trying to find a foothold in non-profit event management because it was the one corner of the professional world that felt like it might actually mean something. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter told me you didn't hesitate." I said I hadn't thought about it enough to hesitate. He said that was exactly what she'd told him. He asked me what I knew about the Foundation's work. I was honest. Not much before that night, but I had spent the 2 days since reading everything I could find. I told him about their pediatric rehab partnership with CHOP, about the scholarship program for families of first responders, about the community sports initiative they ran in South Philly for kids recovering from major injuries. I had read it all because I wanted to understand the context of what had happened that night, not because I thought I was going to be sitting across a desk from its founder. Gordon Aldrich looked at me for a long moment. He said he had a coordinator position opening up in the Foundation's Community Outreach Division. It wasn't glamorous. It was logistics, community contacts, scheduling, and a lot of driving to program sites in neighborhoods where parking was terrible. The salary was $42,000 a year. He said he thought I might be worth a conversation with his programs director. I said I'd like that very much. I got the job. I started 3 weeks later. I want to be careful here about the story I'm telling, because it would be easy to frame what came next as a fairy tale, and it wasn't. It was a job, a real job with a learning curve and a small desk and a programs director named Harriet who expected a lot and explained nothing twice. I made mistakes. I once scheduled 3 site visits on the same afternoon and had to call all 3 program coordinators and apologize individually. I underestimated how much emotional weight goes into this kind of work. How much of the job is just showing up for people on hard days and not letting the hardness get into you. But I learned, and somewhere in the rhythm of hospital waiting rooms and school gymnasiums and community center parking lots, I began to understand what the Foundation was actually doing. It wasn't writing checks. It was building a scaffold around people in the worst moments of their lives and saying, "You are still here. You still get to be here." Vivian came to program events occasionally. Not frequently at first. She worked as an architect and had her own firms in Center City, and her involvement with the Foundation was careful, deliberate. She would arrive, assess, and leave before she could be made into the focal point of anyone's agenda. I respected that immediately. I had watched people at charitable events treat the Foundation's program recipients like props in their own generosity narrative, and I noticed that Vivian never did that. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered names. We began talking, the way you do when you're at the same events regularly. Not about the night at the Harrington, not directly, about the work. She had opinions about the sports initiative and about whether the Foundation was reaching the right age group. She had watched her father build this organization for 20 years, and she understood it from the inside out. One afternoon at a site visit in Kensington, standing outside a rec center in November while the kids finished up, she said something I've thought about many times since. She said the hardest part of her recovery hadn't been the physical therapy, or the phantom pain, or learning to do everything differently. The hardest part had been walking back into rooms. I asked her what she meant. She said that after the accident, she had started treating every room as a potential judgment. She would calculate, before she walked through any door, how many people were likely to look, how many would try not to look, how many would say something well-meaning that still landed wrong. She said she had gotten very good at reading rooms from the outside and deciding not to go in. I said that sounded exhausting. She said it had been. Then she said the night at the Harrington. She had almost not gone in either. She had sat in her car in the parking garage for 22 minutes before the event. Her escort had been outside smoking and had come back and told her she was being ridiculous and she should just go in, and the way he said it had made her feel worse, not better. She went in because she had promised her father she would be there. That was the only reason. She had planned exactly where she would sit and had memorized the nearest exit, and had fully intended to leave during dessert. Then her escort had left during cocktail hour, and then I had walked across the room. She didn't say thank you that afternoon in Kensington. I didn't expect her to. She just told me the sequence of events the way you tell someone a story when you trust them to hold it carefully, and then the rec center doors opened, and the kids came piling out, and the moment moved on naturally into the next one. That's the thing about real life. The meaningful moments don't announce themselves. They just happen, and then they're over, and you carry them with you. The setbacks came because they always do. A reporter from a local outlet wrote a piece about the foundation and included a sidebar about Vivienne that she hadn't agreed to and hadn't been asked about. The piece was positive in the way that condescends to its subject, framing her as inspirational in every sentence while stripping away all the specific complexity of who she actually was. She was quiet after that for a few weeks, pulled back from events. I got a brief text from her saying she needed to recalibrate. I said I understood. I didn't push. There was also a board meeting in the spring where two of the foundation's corporate donors raised concerns about the direction of the community outreach program. They felt the foundation was spreading too thin, that focusing on pediatric rehab in lower-income neighborhoods wasn't generating the visibility that justified their level of investment. I sat in the back of that room and listened to men in expensive suits explain to Gordon Aldrich that suffering was most valuable when it was photogenic and broadly relatable. Gordon was measured and firm, but after the room cleared, he stood at the window for a long time before he said anything. He said, "This is the work, keeping the mission when the noise gets loud. Don't let the noise get loud inside you." I wrote that down. I still have it. The fall program expansion was the turning point. The foundation partnered with 3 new rehabilitation centers in the region, and I was coordinating all the logistics, which meant I was everywhere at once for about 3 months. Vivienne had come back fully by then, and she had started attending board meetings and speaking at them, which was new. She didn't ease into it. She walked in and sat at the table and said exactly what she thought about the community sports initiative and the age gap they were missing in the scholarship program, and the board listened because she was right. I watched that and felt something complicated. Pride is part of it, but it's also the feeling of watching someone decide to take up the space they were always entitled to. One evening in October, after a long board dinner had finally wound down, Vivienne and I ended up in the elevator together. She was tired in the visible way. The kind of tired that isn't about the hour. She leaned against the wall of the elevator and looked at the floor numbers changing and said, "I used to think the accident was the thing that broke me. The arm, the reconstruction, all of it." I waited, she said. "It wasn't. The thing that broke me was deciding it meant I had to make myself smaller, that I didn't get to take up the same room as everyone else." The elevator opened. We walked out into the parking garage together. I had my keys in my hand. She had hers. She stopped before we went to our separate cars and looked at me in that direct, assessing way she had. She said, "You gave me back the room. I didn't know what to say." I told her she had done that herself, that I had just walked across a floor. She said yes. But sometimes that's everything. That was 14 months ago. Since then, the foundation has opened 2 new program sites in Chester and Camden, and the scholarship for first responder families has expanded to cover New Jersey as well as Pennsylvania. Vivienne now chairs the Community Advisory Board. She walks into every room like she is exactly where she intends to be, because she has decided that is true, and once she decides something, the room itself seems to rearrange around it. I am still at the foundation, still in the same small office, still learning, still making the occasional spectacular scheduling error that Harriet has decided is part of my character. I am not a parking attendant anymore. I am not eating peanut butter sandwiches in a car with 190,000 miles on it, wondering if anything is going to work out. Last November, the foundation held its annual gala again. Same ballroom at the Harrington Convention Center, same gardenias and white tablecloths and string quartet. Vivian was on the program as a speaker, not as an honoree, as a voice. Before the program started, she came and found me at the back of the room. I was standing near the same rear entrance where I'd stood the year before in my parking vest. She was in a dark green dress this time, and she wore the prosthetic openly the way she always did now, without adjustment or apology. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked around the room. Then she said, "I told her I'd noticed." She smiled. That private, warm smile I had learned to recognize. Then someone called her name from the front and she turned to go. I stayed at the back of the room and watched her walk toward the stage. Through the crowd that parted for her, not because she needed them to, but because she moved with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where they're going. I have never told this story publicly before. I've thought about whether I should, whether it was mine to tell. I decided it was partly mine, because I was there and it changed me too, and because I think there are people who need to hear not just about her courage, but about the small moments that accumulate into a life. The 22 minutes in a parking garage, the elevator at the end of a long evening, the walk across a room that nobody asked me to make. Vivian once told me that the night at the Harrington wasn't a story about kindness. It was a story about dignity, about one person refusing to let another person be invisible. She was right, and I will carry it for as long as I have anything left to carry.